Some moments in life arrive quietly, wrapped in hunger and desperation, carrying the weight of every choice we've ever made. The winter of 1887 brought one such moment to a remote Colorado trading post, where a frail woman stood shivering in the doorway, asking a simple question, "Do you have any leftovers?" The mountain man behind the counter could have said no. He could have turned her away like so many others had. Instead, Caleb Stone did something that defied all reason. He gave her everything: his food, his fire, his shelter, and then he spoke words that shattered her world. What he revealed wasn't just an act of kindness. It was a truth 30 years in the making. What secret connected these two strangers across 3 decades of silence? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The trading post sat like a weathered sentinel at the edge of the world, where the Rocky Mountains carved their jagged teeth into the Colorado sky. Caleb Stone had built it with his own hands 17 years ago, choosing this particular spot for reasons he told no one. The location made little sense to those who knew the territory. It wasn't on a major trail, wasn't near any mining camps that might bring steady business. It simply existed in a fold of the mountains where 3 valleys met, accessible enough for those who needed it, remote enough for a man who wanted to be left alone. The structure itself was solid, hewn logs, chinked with clay and moss, a stone chimney that drew clean, a roof that had weathered 100 storms. Inside, the single large room served as both store and living quarters. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with the essentials that trappers and the occasional traveler might need: salt, tobacco, ammunition, coffee, dried beans, flour. Caleb kept a fair inventory, ordered supplies twice a year from Denver, paid his bills on time. He charged honest prices, extended no credit, and asked no questions. Men appreciated that about him. The back corner held his private space, separated by a heavy canvas curtain, a narrow bed, a trunk, a small desk where he kept his accounts. Above the stone fireplace hung a hand-carved wooden spoon, its handle worn smooth with age and use. Visitors sometimes remarked on it, seemed an odd decoration for a bachelor mountain man. Caleb never explained it. He was 52 years old that winter, though he might have passed for older. The mountain sun and wind had carved lines deep into his face, and his hair had gone mostly grey. But his back was still straight, his hands still steady, and his grey eyes still sharp. He stood just over 6 feet tall, lean and strong in the way of men who worked hard every day of their lives. His voice, when he used it, carried the measured cadence of education, another oddity that drew occasional notice. He spoke like a man who'd read books, who'd lived a different life before this one. Most days followed the same pattern: rise before dawn, build up the fire, put coffee on to boil, check the stock, note what needed ordering, tend to the 2 mules in the lean-to behind the post, chop wood, repair whatever needed repairing, wait for customers who might or might not come. In winter, sometimes a week would pass without seeing another soul. Caleb didn't mind the solitude. He'd chosen it deliberately, the way another man might choose a wife or a profession. He was cordial to those who came. Native traders from the Ute bands brought furs and game, received fair value in goods. Trappers stopped for supplies, sometimes stayed the night in the small loft if weather was bad. A circuit preacher came through twice a year. Once, a family heading west had sheltered here for 3 days during a blizzard. Caleb had been kind, generous even, but there was always a distance he maintained, a line no one was invited to cross. Old Tom Bridger, a trapper who'd worked these mountains for 40 years, had once told a greenhorn, "Stone's a fair man, but he ain't a friendly one. Don't mistake courtesy for companionship. He's got ghosts, that one. Whatever he's running from or waiting for, he means to do it alone." Tom was partly right. Caleb did have ghosts, but he wasn't running from them. He was keeping vigil. The wooden spoon had belonged to Elizabeth. She'd carved it herself the first winter they were married, working by firelight in the evenings while he read to her from whatever book they had. Her hands had been small but capable, and she'd been proud of that spoon. Every home needs one good wooden spoon, she'd told him, laughing, for stirring, for serving, for rapping the knuckles of husbands who try to sneak tastes before supper's ready. That was 30 years ago, a lifetime ago, another world. Caleb had been 22 then, fresh from a brief stint in the cavalry, full of plans and certainty about the future. Elizabeth Hayes had been 19, the daughter of a schoolteacher in a small Kansas town. They'd met at a church social, married 3 months later, over her father's objections. "You've got nothing," her father had said. "No property, no prospects. What kind of life can you give her?" But Elizabeth hadn't cared about property or prospects. She'd loved him, and he'd loved her with an intensity that still ached when he let himself remember it. They'd been so young, so sure that love was enough. They'd homesteaded in eastern Colorado, built a cabin, worked the land. It was hard, but they were happy. Elizabeth sang while she worked. She made their small cabin into a home, with curtains sewn from flour sacks and wildflowers in tin cups. She read everything she could get her hands on and taught Caleb to see beauty in things he'd never noticed before. The particular gold of aspen leaves in fall, the architecture of a bird's nest, the mathematics of a snowflake. When she got pregnant, they were overjoyed. Terrified, but overjoyed. They chose names: Margaret for a girl, James for a boy. Elizabeth sewed tiny clothes. Caleb built a cradle. They talked about the future, about the family they'd raise, the life they'd build together. The labor started early, in the middle of a March blizzard. No doctor within 20 miles, no help coming. Caleb did everything he knew to do, everything Elizabeth's mother had told them in letters. But it wasn't enough. The baby came. A girl, perfect and crying. And Elizabeth bled, kept bleeding. Nothing he did could stop it. She'd held the baby once, maybe for 5 minutes, looked into her daughter's face with such love it hurt to witness. "Margaret," she'd whispered, "our Margaret." Then she'd looked at Caleb. "Take care of her. Promise me you'll take care of our girl." He'd promised. Of course he'd promised. Elizabeth died an hour later, just as the storm finally broke and the sun came out. The next days were a blur of grief and responsibility. He buried his wife in the meadow where she'd loved to pick wildflowers. He tried to care for the baby, but he had no idea how to feed an infant, how to keep her alive. She cried constantly, and he was terrified she'd die too. Elizabeth's sister, Rachel Hayes, arrived 4 days later. She'd ridden hard from Kansas when word reached her. She took one look at Caleb, unshaven, wild-eyed, holding the screaming baby with shaking hands, and made her judgment. "You can't care for her," Rachel said, not unkindly at first, but firmly. "You're a man alone. She needs a woman's care, a family, a proper home." "She has a home," Caleb had said. "I'm her father. I promised Elizabeth. You promised my sister you'd take care of her daughter. Look at yourself. Look at this place. Is this taking care of her?" They'd argued for hours. Rachel had never liked him, had thought her sister deserved better than a penniless homesteader. Now, with Elizabeth dead, she saw her chance to correct what she viewed as her sister's mistake. "I can provide for her," Rachel said. "I have a good home in Street Louis, a husband with means. We can give her everything: education, society, a future. What can you give her? Poverty and struggle and a motherless childhood on a failing homestead?" Every word was a knife, made sharper by the grain of truth in it. Caleb looked at his daughter, so tiny and helpless, and felt the weight of his inadequacy. "Let me keep her," he'd begged. "I'll learn. I'll do better. She's all I have left of Elizabeth." "This isn't about what you have left," Rachel said coldly. "This is about what's best for this child. And you, in your heart, know that isn't you." In the end, Rachel simply took her, packed up the baby and the few things Elizabeth had made for her, and left. Caleb tried to follow, tried to fight, but Rachel had the law on her side. A single man, barely making ends meet, versus a prosperous married couple. The local judge didn't even hesitate. "You can visit," Rachel said as she left. "Once we're settled, once things are stable, you can come see her." But when Caleb went to Street Louis 6 months later, Rachel and her husband had moved. No forwarding address, no way to find them. He searched for 2 years, spent every penny he had, followed every lead, asked in every city between Missouri and California. Nothing. Rachel had made sure of it. She'd taken his daughter and erased him from her life. Eventually, broken and defeated, Caleb had stopped searching. He sold the homestead, took the money, and headed into the mountains. Built this trading post in the middle of nowhere and waited. For what? He wasn't sure at first. Justice? Forgiveness? A second chance? But as the years passed, a strange certainty settled over him. Someday, somehow, his daughter would come here. He didn't know how he knew it. Faith, maybe, or just refusal to accept that he'd lost her forever. He imagined her grown, traveling west for some reason, needing supplies or shelter. Walking through that door, he'd know her somehow. Maybe she'd have Elizabeth's eyes, her smile, and he'd finally keep the promise he'd made. 17 years he'd waited. 17 years of every opening door being a moment of possibility, of hope. Hundreds of travelers had come and gone. None of them were her. Until the winter afternoon, when a frail, elderly woman appeared in his doorway, barely standing, and asked, "Do you have any leftovers?" And Caleb Stone, looking into her weathered face, saw something that made his breath catch, something in the shape of her eyes, the line of her jaw, a ghost of the girl he'd only held for a few moments 30 years ago. His daughter had finally come home. The woman swayed in the doorway, one hand gripping the frame for support. Her dress was little more than rags, patched and repatched until the original fabric was barely visible. A threadbare shawl wrapped around her shoulders provided scant protection against the December cold. Her face was gaunt, cheekbones sharp beneath wind-burned skin, and her lips had gone pale. But it was her eyes that caught Caleb, dark brown, the exact shade of Elizabeth's, set in a face that hunger and hardship had aged beyond its years. "Do you have any leftovers?" she asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can work for them. I can clean or mend things, or—" She didn't finish the sentence. Her knees buckled, and she began to collapse. Caleb moved faster than he had in years, crossing the room in 3 strides and catching her before she hit the floor. She weighed almost nothing, just bone and sinew wrapped in worn cloth. He lifted her easily, disturbed by how fragile she felt in his arms, and carried her to the chair by the fire. "Easy now," he said, his voice rough with disuse, and something else, an emotion he couldn't quite name. "Easy. You're safe here." Her eyes fluttered open, confusion and fear mixing in their depths. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to. I can go. I just thought—" "You're not going anywhere," Caleb said, more firmly than he'd intended. He gentled his tone. She tried to think, her brow furrowing. "I had some berries. 2 days ago, I think, or maybe 3. The days run together when you're walking. 2 or 3 days. God Almighty." Caleb moved to the shelves, pulling down supplies with hands that trembled slightly. Bread, dried meat, a jar of preserves. He filled a cup with water from the barrel, then stopped himself. Water alone on an empty stomach could make her sick. He put a pot on the fire instead, added water, and began making a simple broth. "Slow sips," he said, bringing her the cup of water. "Not too fast, or you'll be ill." She took the cup with both hands. They shook so badly the water nearly spilled. Caleb steadied them with his own, helped her raise it to her lips. She drank like someone who'd forgotten what water tasted like, and he had to gently pull the cup away before she made herself sick. "More in a minute," he promised. "Let that settle first." While the broth heated, Caleb added wood to the fire and watched the woman from the corner of his eye. She sat hunched in the chair, trying to get warm, her gaze moving around the room with a mixture of wonder and wariness. He saw her take in the well-stocked shelves, the clean floor, the orderly arrangement of goods. Saw her eyes linger on the wooden spoon above the fireplace. "That's beautiful work," she said quietly. "The spoon, did you carve it?" Caleb's throat tightened. "No," he managed. "Someone I knew. A long time ago." The broth began to steam. He ladled some into a bowl, made himself take his time, not too much at once, brought it to her with a piece of bread. "Small bites," he instructed. "Your stomach needs to remember what food is." She ate like he told her, taking tiny, careful sips of the broth, nibbling at the bread. Color began to return to her face. After a few minutes, she looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said. "I don't know how to thank you. I've been turned away from so many places. Most people, they see someone like me and they—" She stopped, swallowed hard. "You're very kind." Caleb didn't know what to say to that. Kind. He hadn't been kind in 30 years. He'd been fair, honest, but never kind. Kindness required opening yourself to others, and he'd locked that part of himself away when Rachel took his daughter. But looking at this woman, starving and desperate, something in him had cracked open. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, as if even that small piece of herself might be dangerous to share. "Margaret," she finally said. "Margaret Hayes." The room seemed to tilt. Caleb gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles going white. Hayes, Elizabeth's maiden name, and Margaret the name they'd chosen, the name Elizabeth had whispered as she held their daughter for those few precious minutes. It couldn't be. The odds were impossible. Hayes wasn't an uncommon name, and Margaret even less so. This woman was too old anyway. She looked 50 or more, weathered and worn. His daughter would only be 30. But those eyes, the shape of her face beneath the ravages of hardship, the way she tilted her head slightly when she spoke. "Are you all right?" Margaret asked, concern cutting through her exhaustion. "You've gone pale." Caleb forced himself to breathe, to release his grip on the table. "I'm fine," he said. "It's just your name. I knew someone with that name once." "It's common enough," Margaret said with a sad smile. "There must be 1,000 Margaret Hayeses in the world." "I suppose so." Caleb moved back to the fire, needing something to do with his hands. "Where are you traveling from?" "Everywhere and nowhere," she said. "I was living in Wyoming territory. My husband passed 2 years ago. His family—" She stopped, her face darkening. "They weren't kind to me after he died. They expected me to work for my keep, but it was never enough. So I left." "And you've been wandering since?" "I tried to find work in the towns. But I'm not young anymore, and people want strong backs for the work that needs doing. I thought perhaps further south in the settlements there might be something." She looked down at her hands. "I didn't plan very well. My supplies ran out. I got turned around in the mountains. If I hadn't seen your post—" She didn't finish, but she didn't need to. They both knew what would have happened. Another few days in the wilderness without food or proper shelter, and she would have frozen to death or simply collapsed and never gotten up. "How old are you?" Caleb asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Margaret looked at him curiously. 29, she said, "though I feel twice that." 29. The exact age his daughter would be. Caleb's mind raced. It still might be coincidence, a cruel trick of fate, nothing more. But he had to know, had to be certain. "Were you born in Wyoming?" "No," Margaret's brow furrowed. "At least, I don't think so. I was raised by my aunt in Street Louis. She told me my mother died when I was a baby. And my father—" She paused, old pain flickering across her face. "She said my father wasn't fit to raise a child, that he'd given me to her to raise properly. Street Louis, an aunt who took her as a baby, a mother who died, a father deemed unfit." Caleb's heart hammered in his chest. He turned away so she wouldn't see his face, pretending to check the fire. His hands shook as he adjusted the logs. "Your aunt," he said carefully. "What was her name?" "Rachel Hayes. Well, Rachel Morrison after she married. Why do you ask?" "Rachel. Elizabeth's sister. The woman who'd stolen his daughter and disappeared. It was her. God help him. It was her. 30 years he'd waited, 30 years of watching every door, hoping and praying for a miracle, and she'd walked in asking for leftovers, so worn down by life that he'd almost not recognized her. His daughter. His little girl, who he'd held for mere minutes before she was taken from him, who he'd promised Elizabeth he'd protect, a promise he'd failed to keep for 3 decades. She was here, finally here, and she had no idea who he was. Caleb stood with his back to her, struggling to compose himself. He wanted to tell her everything, right now, this instant. Wanted to pull out the marriage certificate he'd kept in his trunk, the few letters Elizabeth had written, the tiny booty she'd sewn. Wanted to say, "I'm your father. I've been waiting for you. I never stopped looking. I never forgot." But he couldn't. Not yet. She was too fragile, too worn down. She'd just barely survived in the wilderness, was just now getting warm and fed. Dropping this revelation on her now might be too much. She might not believe him, might think he was mad or trying to trick her somehow. He needed to be careful, needed to let her recover, build trust, find the right moment. But looking at her sitting by his fire, eating the food he'd given her, alive and here after all these years, Caleb felt something he'd thought long dead, stirring in his chest. "Hope, you'll stay here," he said, turning back to face her. "Rest, recover. There's a loft upstairs where you can sleep. I have plenty of supplies. You don't need to go back out into the cold." Margaret's eyes widened. "I couldn't impose like that. You've already done so much." "It's not an imposition," Caleb said. "I could use help around the post. Stock needs organizing, accounts need updating. If you're willing to work, we can call it even." It was a lie. He didn't need help, but he needed her to stay, needed time to figure out how to tell her who she was, who he was. Margaret studied his face for a long moment, searching for something. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly. "All right," she said. "Thank you. I'll work hard. I promise. I won't be a burden." "You're not a burden," Caleb said quietly. She smiled then, a real smile that transformed her tired face, and Caleb saw Elizabeth so clearly it hurt. The same smile that used to greet him when he came in from the fields, the same warmth and gentleness. His daughter was home. After 30 years of wandering and waiting, his daughter was finally home. Now he just had to find the courage to tell her. January brought a blizzard that lasted 4 days. The wind howled like something alive, rattling the shutters and piling snow against the trading post until the door barely opened. Caleb and Margaret were trapped inside together, cut off from the outside world in a way that felt both intimate and precarious. On the second day of the storm, they ran out of small tasks to occupy their hands and minds. The inventory was counted, the shelves organized, the accounts balanced. They sat by the fire, listening to the wind, and Margaret finally asked the question Caleb had been dreading. "Tell me about your family," she said. "You've lived alone here for so many years. Did you never marry? Have children?" Caleb's hands tightened on his coffee cup. This was it. The moment he could tell her, should tell her. The words were right there, demanding to be spoken. "I was married once," he said slowly. "A long time ago." Margaret leaned forward, her interest genuine. "What happened?" "She died." The words came out rougher than he'd intended. "In childbirth, both she and the baby. It was a lie, but only half of one. Elizabeth had died. The baby had been taken. It amounted to the same thing, he'd lost them both." "I'm so sorry," Margaret said softly. "That must have been devastating. It was 30 years ago." Caleb stared into the fire. Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Sometimes it feels like it happened to someone else in a different life. Do you still love her? The question caught him off guard. He looked at Margaret, saw genuine curiosity and compassion in her face, and realized she was asking as one lonely soul to another. She wanted to know if love could last beyond death, beyond decades of separation. Every day, Caleb admitted. She was everything good I'd known in this world. Smart, kind, brave. She saw beauty in things most people overlooked. She made me want to be better than I was. Margaret touched the locket at her throat, an unconscious gesture. That's how I imagine my mother was. Rachel would never talk about her, but sometimes I'd catch her with this distant look, almost sad. I think she loved her sister, in her own way. I think losing her hurt more than Rachel ever let on. Tell me about your mother, Caleb said, seizing the opening. What did Rachel tell you about her? Very little. Her name was Elizabeth. She was younger than Rachel by several years. Rachel said she was beautiful but naive, that she fell in love with a man who couldn't provide for her properly. They married against the family's wishes and moved west to Homestead. When Elizabeth died having me, Rachel said it was a tragedy that could have been prevented if my mother had married someone suitable, someone with means to afford a doctor. Every word was designed to paint him as the villain. Caleb felt anger rising in his chest, but he pushed it down. Anger wouldn't help, the truth would. Did Rachel tell you your mother's married name? He asked carefully. Margaret frowned, thinking, I don't think she ever did. She always referred to her as Elizabeth Hayes, her maiden name. Now that you mention it, that's strange, isn't it? Why wouldn't she use my mother's married name? Maybe she wanted to forget the man who married her sister, Caleb suggested, if she blamed him for Elizabeth's death. Perhaps. Margaret's frown deepened. Sometimes I wonder if Rachel told me the truth about everything. There were so many gaps in the story, so many questions she refused to answer, like where I was born, exactly, or where my mother was buried. Once I asked if I could visit her grave, and Rachel became very angry, said the past was the past, and I needed to focus on my duties to the living. Caleb's jaw clenched. Rachel had denied his daughter even the comfort of visiting her mother's grave. Not that Margaret could have found it anyway. Elizabeth was buried in an unmarked spot in a meadow in eastern Colorado, beneath a simple wooden cross Caleb had carved himself. He'd gone back once, years later, to put up a proper stone marker. It was one of the few things he'd done that had brought him any peace. The locket, he said, nodding toward it. Rachel said it was your mother's. Do you know anything else about it? Margaret lifted it, opened it to show him again the lock of hair and worn inscription. Just that it was precious to her. Rachel gave it to me on my 16th birthday and told me to treasure it, that it was the only thing of my mother's that had survived. I've worn it every day since. Caleb wanted to tell her that he'd given that locket to Elizabeth, that he'd worked extra jobs for 2 months to afford it, that Elizabeth had cried when he presented it to her on their wedding day, had called it the most beautiful thing she'd ever owned, that the engraving was his doing, E.S., for Elizabeth Stone, the name she'd taken with such pride and joy. But again the words stuck. To reveal the locket's origin was to reveal everything, and he wasn't ready. Not yet. Your mother sounds like she was a remarkable woman, Caleb said instead. You should be proud to have her blood. I wish I'd known her. Margaret closed the locket gently. Sometimes I try to imagine what she looked like, what her voice sounded like, what made her laugh, but it's all blank spaces. Rachel wouldn't even show me a picture. Perhaps she didn't have one. Perhaps. Or perhaps. Margaret stopped herself, shook her head. Never mind. Say it, Caleb urged. Margaret looked at him, something vulnerable in her expression. Sometimes I wonder if Rachel kept things from me deliberately, if maybe she was jealous of Elizabeth, or angry with her for dying, or I don't know. It just feels like there's a whole story I was never told, like there are secrets buried so deep I'll never uncover them. Maybe the secrets aren't as buried as you think, Caleb said quietly. Maybe they're closer than you realize. Margaret tilted her head, studying him. You say the strangest things sometimes. It's like you're speaking in riddles. Caleb managed a slight smile. Forgive an old man his odd turns of phrase. The storm continued to rage outside. They prepared supper together, moving around the small kitchen space with the ease of people who'd learned each other's rhythms. As they ate, Caleb watched Margaret and thought about all the meals he'd missed with her. All the birthdays, all the ordinary days, all the moments of her growing up that Rachel had stolen from him. But she was here now. That was what mattered. She was safe and warm and fed, sitting at his table, becoming more herself with each passing day. The haunted, desperate woman who'd stumbled into his trading post was transforming into someone stronger, more confident. It was like watching a flower bloom after a long winter. After supper, as they sat by the fire, Margaret suddenly spoke. I was raised to believe my father was worthless, she said quietly. Rachel made sure I understood that he'd failed my mother, failed me. For years I was angry at him. This man I'd never met, angry that he'd been too weak or selfish or poor to keep his family together. Caleb's breath caught. He couldn't speak, couldn't move. But lately, Margaret continued, still staring at the fire, I've been wondering if maybe Rachel lied. Maybe my father wasn't worthless at all. Maybe he was just unlucky. Maybe he loved my mother and me, but circumstances, life, took us away from him. Why the change? Caleb managed to ask. Margaret turned to look at him, her eyes bright in the firelight. Because of you. Because you've shown me that kindness exists, that there are good men in the world who do right by others, even when they have no obligation to. If a stranger like you could show me such compassion, maybe my own father... She stopped, swallowed hard. Maybe he wasn't the monster Rachel made him out to be. Caleb felt tears pricking at his eyes. He blinked them back, overwhelmed by the gift she'd just unknowingly given him, the possibility of redemption, of being seen not as a failure, but as someone who'd loved and lost and done his best. I'm sure your father loved you, Caleb said, his voice thick. I'm sure losing you broke his heart. Margaret smiled sadly. I'd like to think so. It's a nicer story than the one I was raised with. Outside, the storm howled. Inside, by the fire, a father and daughter sat together, separated by a truth that hung between them like a living thing, waiting for the moment to finally be spoken aloud. The blizzard finally broke on the 5th day. Caleb woke to silence. The absence of wind was almost louder than the storm had been. He rose quietly, not wanting to wake Margaret in the loft, and stepped outside into a world transformed. Snow stretched in every direction, pristine and blinding in the early morning sun. The drifts reached above his waist in places, and the path to the lean-to where the mules were kept had completely disappeared. It would take hours to dig out. He was contemplating where to start when he heard the ladder creak behind him. Margaret emerged, wrapped in a blanket, and stood in the doorway taking in the view. It's beautiful, she breathed. I've never seen so much snow. It's beautiful until you have to move it, Caleb said with a slight smile. We've got a full day's work ahead of us. They worked together through the morning, shoveling paths, checking on the mules, clearing the roof before the weight of the snow became dangerous. Margaret proved stronger than she looked, working steadily without complaint. By midday they were both exhausted, red-cheeked and breathing hard. As they took a break, sharing coffee and cold biscuits, Margaret asked a question that stopped Caleb's heart. That spoon above the fireplace, she said, the one you said belonged to someone you knew, was it your wife's? Caleb set down his coffee carefully. Yes. Why do you keep it there? Doesn't it hurt seeing it every day, being reminded of what you lost? At first it did, Caleb admitted, but over time it became a comfort, I suppose. A reminder that I once had something worth grieving for, that my life wasn't always, he gestured around them, This, Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then, may I see it? Caleb's hands trembled slightly as he reached up and took the spoon down from its place. He'd hung it there 17 years ago when he built the post, and it hadn't been touched since. He handed it to Margaret, watching her face as she examined it. "The workmanship is lovely," she said, running her finger along the smooth handle. "She must have been talented." She was. She could make beauty out of nothing. Even when we had next to nothing, she found ways to make our home. He stopped, realizing he was saying too much, revealing too much. "What was her name?" Margaret asked softly. The moment stretched. Caleb could end this now, could say the name Elizabeth and watch recognition dawn in his daughter's eyes. The locket around her neck had belonged to a woman named Elizabeth. She'd just told him her mother's name was Elizabeth. The coincidence would be too great to ignore. "Elizabeth," he said, and watched her face. Margaret's expression shifted, surprise and something like wonder crossing her features. "Elizabeth," she repeated. "That was my mother's name too." "It's a common name," Caleb said, though his heart was hammering. "Yes." But Margaret looked down at the spoon, then back at Caleb. "Your wife died in childbirth 30 years ago. My mother died in childbirth 30 years ago. They had the same name, Caleb. That can't be coincidence. There are many tragedies in the world," Caleb said carefully. "Many women named Elizabeth who died too young." But Margaret wasn't listening. She'd set the spoon down and was unfastening the locket with shaking hands. She opened it, held it close, examining the worn inscription in the bright sunlight streaming through the window. "E.S.," she said. "I always thought it was just my mother's initials, Elizabeth something. But what if the S was her married initial? What if she was Elizabeth Stone?" Caleb couldn't speak. His throat had closed completely. Margaret looked up at him, her eyes wide. "Caleb Stone. Your name is Caleb Stone. If she married you, she would have been Elizabeth Stone. E.S. Margaret." "Rachel never told me my mother's married name," Margaret continued, the words coming faster now. "She always called her Elizabeth Hayes. But that was her maiden name, not her married name. Why would Rachel do that, unless—" She stopped, the color draining from her face. "Unless she was trying to hide who my mother had married." "You're making connections where there might not be any," Caleb tried. But even he could hear how weak it sounded. Margaret stood abruptly, the locket clutched in her hand. "You said your wife died having a baby." Caleb stood too, his heart breaking. This wasn't how he'd wanted her to find out. He'd wanted to tell her gently, with all the evidence laid out, with time to explain and comfort. Not like this. Not with her piecing it together in shock and confusion. "Margaret, please sit down. Let me explain." "What happened to the baby?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Did it die too? You said both she and the baby, but was that true?" "The baby lived," Caleb said quietly. "A girl. She lived for a few minutes in my arms, and then her aunt took her away, and I never saw her again." The words hung in the air between them. Margaret swayed slightly, and Caleb moved forward to steady her, but she stepped back. "Her aunt," Margaret whispered. "Rachel. You're saying Rachel took your baby." "Rachel took my daughter, told me I wasn't fit to raise her, used the law to make it legal, then disappeared so I could never find her again." The words were pouring out now, unstoppable. "I searched for 2 years, spent every penny I had, asked in every city between here and the Mississippi. But Rachel had covered her tracks too well." Margaret's hand went to her throat, to the locket. "What was your daughter's name?" "Margaret," Caleb said, his voice breaking. "We named her Margaret, after Elizabeth's grandmother." The truth settled between them like snow, silent and inevitable. Margaret's face crumpled, and then she was crying great, heaving sobs that shook her whole body. Caleb wanted to go to her, to hold her, but he didn't know if he had the right. Didn't know if she'd want comfort from him now that she knew. "I'm your daughter," she said through her tears. "You're my father. All this time, all these weeks you knew. You knew and you didn't tell me." "I wanted to," Caleb said desperately, "from the moment you said your name. But you were so fragile, so hurt. I was afraid." "Afraid of what? That I'd reject you? That I'd leave?" Margaret wiped at her face angrily. "I had a right to know. This is my life, my history, my identity. You had no right to keep it from me." "I know," Caleb said quietly. "You're right. I should have told you immediately. I was selfish and scared, and I'm sorry." They stood facing each other, father and daughter, strangers and family, the weight of 30 years and 1,000 miles between them. Margaret turned away from him, her shoulders shaking. Caleb stood frozen, wanting to reach for her but terrified of making things worse. The silence stretched, broken only by her ragged breathing and the crackling of the fire. Finally she spoke without turning around. "Prove it. You say I'm your daughter. Prove it." "Of course." Caleb moved to the canvas curtain that separated his private space, pulling it aside. His hands shook as he opened the old trunk at the foot of his bed. He'd kept everything, treasured every scrap of evidence of the life he'd once had. He pulled out the items one by one, carrying them to the table where Margaret could see. A marriage certificate, the paper yellowed but the ink still clear. Caleb Stone and Elizabeth Hayes, married the 15th of June, 1857. A small leather journal, its pages filled with Elizabeth's handwriting, letters she'd written to her sister before the rift, describing her happiness, her love for Caleb, her joy at being pregnant. A tiny knitted bootie, soft white wool never worn. And finally, a daguerreotype photograph in a simple frame. The photograph showed a young couple on their wedding day. Caleb, barely 22, stood tall and proud in his only suit. Beside him, Elizabeth smiled radiantly, her hand tucked into his arm. She wore a simple dress and held a small bouquet of wildflowers. Her face was young and unlined, but unmistakably the same bone structure that Margaret saw in her own mirror every day. Margaret picked up the photograph with trembling hands. She stared at it for a long moment, then looked at the marriage certificate, then back at the photograph. "She looks like me," she whispered. "Or I look like her." "You have her eyes," Caleb said softly. "Her smile, the way you tilt your head when you're thinking. I saw it the moment you walked through that door." Margaret set down the photograph and picked up the journal. She opened it to a random page and began to read aloud, her voice shaking. "December 3rd, 1857. The baby kicked today, strong enough that Caleb felt it when he put his hand on my belly. He looked so amazed, so full of wonder. I love him more than I thought it was possible to love another person. Whatever happens, whatever trials we face, I know we'll face them together. I'm the luckiest woman alive." Tears streamed down Margaret's face. She flipped through more pages, reading snippets of her mother's thoughts, her mother's love, her mother's hopes for the future. The journal ended abruptly in late February 1858, just weeks before Margaret's birth. "She wanted me," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "She was happy about having me." "She was overjoyed," Caleb said. "We both were. You were going to be our whole world." Margaret picked up one of the letters, dated from earlier in the marriage. It was addressed to Rachel, full of Elizabeth's excitement about her new life, her new husband, her dreams for their homestead. The tone was loving, hopeful, with no hint of the bitterness that would come later. "Rachel must have hated you so much after Elizabeth died," Margaret said. "She blamed you." "She did. She was grief-stricken and angry, and I was the easiest target. I was the one who'd taken her sister away from the safety of St. Louis to Homestead in Colorado. I was the one who'd gotten her pregnant. In Rachel's mind, I'd killed Elizabeth as surely as if I'd pulled a trigger. But it wasn't your fault," Margaret said fiercely. "Women die in childbirth. It's a tragedy, but it's not murder. I know that now. But at the time, I half believed her. I was so consumed with grief and guilt that when Rachel said I wasn't fit to raise you, part of me thought she might be right. I'd failed to save Elizabeth. How could I be trusted with her baby? Margaret set down the letter and looked at him directly for the first time since the revelation. Her face was ravaged with tears, but there was something else there too, a desperate need to understand. "Tell me what happened," she said. "All of it, from the beginning. I want to know everything." So Caleb told her. He described meeting Elizabeth at that church social in Kansas, the instant connection they'd felt, their courtship under her father's disapproving eye, the joy of their wedding day, the hard but happy years on the homestead, Elizabeth's pregnancy and their excitement as they prepared for parenthood. He told her about the blizzard, the difficult labor, Elizabeth's final words. "Promise me you'll take care of our girl," she'd said. And he had promised. God, how he'd promised. He described Rachel's arrival, the arguments, his own desperation and exhaustion, the way Rachel had gradually worn him down with her certainty that he couldn't care for an infant alone, his moment of weakness when he'd agreed to let Rachel take the baby temporarily, just until he got back on his feet. "But she never brought you back," Caleb said, his voice rough with old pain. "I went to St. Louis 6 months later, as soon as I could scrape together the money for the journey. But Rachel and her husband had moved. No one knew where, or if they did, they wouldn't tell me. I searched for 2 years, hired investigators, followed every lead, but Rachel had made sure I'd never find her." "Why?" Margaret asked. "Why go to such lengths? If she thought you were unfit, why hide me so completely?" "Because she knew that eventually I'd get my life together. I was young, I was capable. Give me a few years, and I'd have the means to provide for you, to fight for custody. She couldn't risk that, so she erased me from your life completely. Changed cities, used her maiden name when referring to your mother, told you I was worthless so you'd never want to find me. She built a wall between us that was meant to last forever." Margaret absorbed this, her face pale but composed now. "When did you come here? To the mountains?" 15 years after you were born. I'd spent those 15 years searching, working, trying to build something, but I'd also become bitter and hollow. Every door that closed, every lead that went nowhere, it took something from me. Eventually I realized I had nothing left to give to the world except my rage and grief. So I came here, built this post, waited. Waited for what? For you." Caleb met her eyes. "It sounds mad, I know, but I had this certainty that someday, somehow, you'd come through that door. That God or fate or random chance would bring you to me. So I stayed here, at the edge of the world, and I kept vigil. For 17 years. You waited for 17 years on nothing but hope." "What else did I have?" Caleb asked simply. "You were all I had left of Elizabeth. The promise I made to her was all I had left of honor, so I waited." Margaret picked up the tiny booty, running her fingers over the delicate stitches. "Elizabeth made this? She made it while sitting by the fire during our last winter together. She was so proud of how the stitches turned out. She made 2, actually, but Rachel took the other one with her when she took you. I never saw it. Rachel never showed me anything that belonged to my mother except the locket." Margaret's voice hardened. "She lied to me my entire life. She stole me from you and then poisoned me against you so I'd never want to know the truth. How could someone be so cruel?" "Grief does strange things to people," Caleb said, "and Rachel's grief was compounded by guilt, I think. She knew her father had been right to oppose our marriage. If Elizabeth had listened to him, had married someone suitable, she might still be alive. Rachel couldn't bear that truth, so she rewrote the story, made me the villain instead of fate or circumstance. It probably made it easier for her to live with herself." Margaret stood abruptly and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. Caleb watched her, his daughter, processing 3 decades of lies and truth. He wanted to comfort her, but didn't know how. What do you say to someone whose entire identity has just been rewritten? All those years, Margaret said quietly. I thought I was alone in the world, an orphan with no real family, just an aunt who resented my existence. I convinced myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need anyone. But all along, I had a father who loved me, who searched for me, who waited for me. She turned to face him, tears streaming down her face again. You waited 30 years. How do I even begin to... Her voice broke. Caleb couldn't stand it anymore. He crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, holding his daughter for the first time since she was 5 minutes old. She collapsed against him, sobbing, and he held her tightly, his own tears falling into her hair. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry for every year we lost, for every birthday I missed, every moment I wasn't there. I'm sorry Rachel poisoned you against me. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I'm sorry for all of it. It wasn't your fault, Margaret said into his shoulder. None of it was your fault. You tried, you searched, you waited. That's more than... She pulled back to look at him. That's more love than I've ever known in my life. They stood there, father and daughter, tears and truth between them, the weight of 30 years of separation finally acknowledged. Outside, the sun was setting over the snow-covered mountains, painting the world in shades of gold and rose. Inside, by the fire, a family was being reborn. The days following the revelation were strange and tender, filled with the careful navigation of a relationship that was both brand new and 30 years old. Caleb and Margaret moved around each other like dancers, learning new steps, finding their rhythm as father and daughter. Margaret spent hours reading Elizabeth's journal, absorbing every detail of her mother's thoughts and feelings. Caleb sat with her, answering questions, sharing memories, filling in the gaps that the written words couldn't cover. He told her about Elizabeth's laugh, the way she sang off-key but with such joy it didn't matter, how she'd loved thunderstorms and hated winter mornings. She would have loved you so much, Caleb said one evening as they sat by the fire. She used to talk about all the things she'd teach you, all the places she'd show you. She wanted to give you everything she'd loved about life. I wish I'd known her, Margaret said, her hand resting on the journal. I spent my whole life feeling incomplete, like there was a piece of me missing. Now I know what it was. It was this history, this connection, this knowledge of where I came from. You have it now, Caleb said gently. I do. Margaret looked at him, her eyes bright. And I have you, a father who wanted me, who fought for me, who never gave up. Do you know how precious that is? How rare? Caleb had to look away, overwhelmed by the gift of her acceptance, her forgiveness for the weeks of deception. Over the next week, Margaret asked about everything: Caleb's childhood, his time in the cavalry, his courtship with Elizabeth, their life together. She wanted to know every detail, as if she could rebuild the past through his words. Caleb found himself talking more than he had in decades, memories pouring out of him like water from a long-sealed well. In turn, Margaret shared her own life with new honesty. She told him about the loneliness of growing up in Rachel's house, always feeling like a burden, about her loveless marriage to Thomas, the years of quiet desperation, about the abuse from his family after his death. I don't want to go back to that, she said one night. I don't ever want to be at someone else's mercy again. You won't be, Caleb promised. This is your home now. This trading post, this land, it's yours as much as mine. More than mine. You're my heir, my daughter. Everything I have is yours. Margaret's eyes widened. Caleb, I can't. You can and you will. I've been alone for 30 years. I built this place with my own hands, but I built it for you. I always knew that if you came, you'd stay, that this would be your inheritance. But what if I'd never come? What if I'd died on the trail before I found you? Then I'd have waited until my own death, and some stranger would have claimed it all, Caleb said simply. But you did come. You're here, and I'll be damned if I let anything take you away from me again. The conviction in his voice made Margaret smile. I'm not going anywhere. This is the first place I've ever felt like I belong. It was 3 weeks after the revelation that their peace was shattered. A rider came to the trading post in the late afternoon, unusual in itself, as few people traveled in deep winter. Caleb was in the lean-to, tending the mules, when he heard Margaret call out to a visitor. By the time he got inside, a man was standing by the fire, warming his hands. He was in his 40s, well-dressed for a frontier traveler, with the look of someone used to giving orders. Behind him stood a younger man, probably his son, and to Caleb's surprise, the local marshal from the town of Grantsville, 20 miles east. "Mr. Stone," the marshal said, nodding, "this is Harvey Morrison and his son William. They've come a long way looking for someone." Caleb's stomach tightened. "Morrison, Rachel's married name. We're looking for Margaret Hayes," Harvey Morrison said, his eyes moving to where Margaret stood near the kitchen area. "Or I suppose it's Margaret Morrison now, since she married my brother Thomas. There you are, Margaret. We've been searching for you for months." Margaret's face had gone pale, but her voice was steady. "What do you want, Harvey?" "You left rather abruptly," Harvey said, his tone mild but with steel underneath. "Without settling Thomas's affairs, without fulfilling your obligations to the family." "I had no obligations to you," Margaret said. "Thomas left the farm to you, remember? You made that very clear." "The farm, yes, but there are debts, Margaret. Thomas owed money before he died. As his widow, you're responsible for those debts." Caleb moved to stand beside Margaret. "I wasn't aware widows inherited their husbands' debts in Wyoming territory." Harvey's eyes flicked to him dismissively. "And you are?" "Plus time, while v. Caleb Stone. This is my trading post. Margaret works for me. Works for you." Harvey's smile didn't reach his eyes. "How convenient. Tell me, Margaret, does your employer know what kind of woman you are? That you abandon family? Shirk your duties?" "That's enough," Caleb said quietly, but with enough force that Harvey's smile faltered. The marshal stepped forward. "Mr. Morrison has documentation showing that Thomas Morrison owed significant sums to various creditors. As the widow, there's an argument that Mrs. Morrison bears some responsibility for settling these debts." "How much?" Caleb asked. $300, Harvey said promptly. It was a significant sum, more than Margaret could possibly have earned in the months she'd been gone. Caleb had his doubts that Thomas had actually owed that much, but that wasn't the point. This was about control, about dragging Margaret back into servitude. "I don't have $300, Margaret said. "I have nothing." "Then you'll have to come back with us," Harvey said. "Work off the debt as you were doing before you ran away." "I didn't run away. I left. There's a difference. The law might see it differently." Harvey nodded to the marshal. "Isn't that right?" The marshal looked uncomfortable. "Well, if there are legitimate debts—" "There's no debt," Caleb interrupted. "Or if there is, I'll pay it. $300, you said?" Harvey's eyes narrowed. "You'd pay a stranger's debts? A woman you barely know?" "Margaret's not a stranger to me," Caleb said evenly. "She's my daughter." The silence that followed was profound. Harvey and William stared at him in disbelief. The marshal's eyebrows rose. Margaret reached for Caleb's hand and squeezed it, a gesture of gratitude and solidarity. "Your daughter," Harvey repeated slowly. "That's impossible. Margaret is the daughter of, well, we don't speak of him, but certainly not you." "I have documentation," Caleb said. "Marriage certificate proving I was married to Elizabeth Hayes. Birth records showing a daughter born in March 1858. Margaret is my daughter, stolen from me by her Aunt Rachel 30 years ago." "Rachel Morrison was my mother," Harvey said coldly, "and she told me about Margaret's father, a worthless homesteader who couldn't provide for his family. She saved Margaret from poverty and gave her a good home." "She lied," Margaret said, her voice shaking with anger. "About everything. My father searched for me for years. Rachel made sure he'd never find me, then filled my head with lies so I'd never want to know the truth. "This is absurd," William Morrison said, speaking for the first time. "You can't just claim to be someone's father after 30 years. "I can when it's the truth," Caleb said. He turned to the marshal. "I have proof. Marriage certificate, letters, a photograph. Margaret has the locket her mother wore, engraved with her married initials. We can establish beyond any doubt that she's my daughter." The marshal rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "If that's true, then any debts from her deceased husband are, well, that's complicated. She's not without family or resources if her father is willing to support her." "I'm not just willing," Caleb said. "I'm insisting. Margaret stays here. If there are legitimate debts to settle, I'll pay them." "But she's not going anywhere with these men." Harvey's face had gone red. "You can't just. She was living with us, working for us. We provided for her for 2 years." "You mean she worked for you for 2 years in exchange for scraps and a bed?" Margaret said. "I earned my keep 10 times over. You owe me, Harvey, not the other way around." "Ungrateful." "Careful," Caleb said softly, and something in his voice made Harvey stop. "That's my daughter you're speaking to." The marshal stepped between them. "Let's all calm down. Mr. Morrison, if you have documentation of these debts, proper legal documentation, then we can review it and determine what's owed. But I'm not taking Mrs. Morrison anywhere today based on your word alone. And if Mr. Stone here is truly her father and willing to settle any legitimate claims, then that's the end of it." "I want to see this proof," Harvey demanded. "This supposed evidence that she's your daughter." Caleb brought out the trunk again, laying out the same documents he'd shown Margaret weeks before. The marriage certificate, the journal, the letters, the photograph. The marshal examined each one carefully while Harvey and William looked on with growing frustration. "It certainly appears legitimate," the marshal finally said. "Mrs. Morrison, do you accept this man as your father?" "I do," Margaret said firmly. "He's my father, and this is my home. I'm not going anywhere." Harvey turned to her, his expression ugly. "You'd believe this stranger over the family who raised you, over Rachel's memory?" "Rachel lied to me my entire life," Margaret said. "She stole me from my father and poisoned me against him. Yes, I believe him, because unlike Rachel, he's telling the truth." "This isn't over," Harvey said. "There are legal proceedings we can pursue." "Pursue them," Caleb said calmly. "But Margaret stays here while you do, and I'll be hiring lawyers to contest any claims you make. I have resources, Mr. Morrison, more than you might think, and I'll spend every penny I have protecting my daughter." The two men stared at each other, the tension thick enough to cut. Finally, the marshal cleared his throat. "I think it's best if we all step back and let the law take its course. Mr. Morrison, you're welcome to file a claim in Grantsville. Mr. Stone, Mrs. Morrison, you'll be notified if anything comes of it. But for now, everyone goes their separate ways, peacefully." Harvey looked like he wanted to argue, but the marshal's hand rested on his gun belt, a subtle reminder of authority. Slowly, Harvey nodded. "Come on, William. We're leaving." He turned at the door. "This isn't finished, Margaret. You'll regret turning your back on family." "You're not my family," Margaret said quietly. "You never were. My family is standing right here beside me." After they left, Margaret sagged against Caleb, trembling. He held her steady, his own heart racing with the confrontation's aftermath. "They'll be back," Margaret said. "You know they will." "Let them come," Caleb replied. "I waited 30 years for you. I'll fight 30 more to keep you safe." The marshal moved faster than Caleb expected. His hand shot out, grabbing the hired man's wrist before the gun could fully clear leather. "Holster that weapon," the marshal ordered, his voice carrying authority that had been absent before. "Now." The hired man hesitated, looking to Harvey for direction. Harvey's jaw clenched, but he gave a sharp nod. The gun disappeared back into its holster. "Marshal," Harvey said tightly, "you saw the document. You're sworn to uphold—" "I'm sworn to uphold the law," the marshal interrupted. "Not to facilitate kidnapping, because that's what this is starting to look like, Mr. Morrison. You come here with hired guns, making threats, trying to force a woman to leave against her will. That's not legal debt collection. That's coercion. She owes a legitimate debt. Maybe she does, maybe she doesn't, but that's for a proper court to decide, not for you to enforce at gunpoint. The marshal turned to Caleb. Mr. Stone, you said you're willing to pay the claimed debt? I am. $400. I'll ride to Grantsville tomorrow and deposit it with the court. They can verify the legitimacy of the claim and distribute funds to actual creditors if they exist. That sounds reasonable to me, the marshal said. He looked at Harvey. That should satisfy any legal obligation Mrs. Morrison might have. It's not about the money. Harvey started again. Then what is it about? The marshal asked sharply. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're trying to force a woman back into unpaid labor using fake debts as justification. That's a crime, Mr. Morrison. A serious one. A munger. Harvey's face flushed red. My mother took this woman in, raised her, gave her everything. Your mother kidnapped her, Caleb said quietly. Stole her from her father and spent 30 years lying about it. That's the truth Rachel couldn't face, so she built a fiction around it. And you've inherited her lies, along with her guilt. How dare you? It's true, Margaret said. Her voice was calm now, steady with certainty. Rachel stole me from my father when I was days old. She told him he wasn't fit to raise me, then disappeared so he could never find me. She spent my entire childhood poisoning me against him, making sure I'd never want to know the truth. And after she died, you continued the pattern, treating me like property, like something you owned instead of a person with rights and dignity. We gave you a home. You gave me a prison, Margaret corrected. One I'm done living in. The marshal was nodding slowly, pieces falling into place. Mrs. Morrison, do you want to go with these men? No. Are you staying here of your own free will? I am. This is my father. This is my home. These men have no claim on me. The marshal turned to Harvey. That settles it then. Mr. Stone will pay the claimed debt through proper channels. Mrs. Morrison is staying here by choice. You and your men need to leave. Now, this is outrageous. This is the law, the marshal said firmly. You want to contest it? Hire a lawyer. Go through the courts properly. But you don't get to ride onto a man's property with armed men and make demands. That's not how civilized people settle disputes. Harvey looked like he wanted to explode, but the marshal's hand rested on his own gun now, a clear statement of where authority lay. After a long, tense moment, Harvey turned and strode toward the door. At the threshold, he looked back at Margaret. You'll regret this. Turning your back on the people who raised you, choosing a stranger. He's not a stranger, Margaret said softly. He's my father. And he's shown me more love in a few weeks than your family showed me in 30 years. I have no regrets. Harvey's expression twisted with rage, and something else, perhaps a flicker of recognition that he was wrong, that his mother had been wrong, that this entire situation was built on a foundation of lies and cruelty. But pride wouldn't let him admit it. Let's go, he said to his men. They mounted up and rode out, the sound of hooves fading into the winter afternoon. The marshal lingered, accepting a cup of coffee from Caleb, while he wrote out a receipt for the promised payment. I had my doubts about that court order from the start, he admitted. Judge Parker doesn't usually handle civil matters like that, and the paperwork was sloppy. I think Mr. Morrison may have obtained it through, let's say, irregular means. Will there be consequences for that? Caleb asked. I'll be looking into it, the marshal said. But my advice, get your own lawyer. Document everything. Make sure your claim as Margaret's father is legally ironclad. Men like Harvey Morrison don't give up easily, especially when they feel they've been made to look foolish. I'll do that, Caleb promised. After the marshal left, Caleb and Margaret stood in the doorway, watching the last traces of the riders disappear into the distance. Margaret leaned against her father's shoulder, and he put his arm around her. "Is it really over?" she asked. "The immediate danger is. But the marshal's right, Harvey won't give up easily. We'll need to make sure everything is legal and documented. I'll get a lawyer from Denver if I have to." "You'd do that? Spend that kind of money?" "Margaret," Caleb turned her to face him, "I'd spend every penny I have. I'd mortgage this land, sell everything I own. You're my daughter. There's nothing I wouldn't do to keep you safe and keep you here where you belong." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. No one has ever—" "I know," Caleb said gently, "but from now on, you'll never doubt it again. You're loved, you're wanted, you're home." She embraced him then, and Caleb held his daughter close, thanking God and fate and whatever force had finally brought her back to him. Spring came to the Colorado mountains the way it always did, slowly at first, then all at once. The snow began to melt in late March, revealing the brown grass and muddy earth beneath. By April, the first wildflowers appeared in the meadows, purple and yellow against the green. The aspens leafed out, their leaves trembling in the mountain breeze. The world was being reborn. So was the trading post. Margaret stood on a ladder, steadying the new sign, while Caleb hammered it into place above the door. The wood was freshly carved, the letters deep and clear, "Stone and Daughter Trading Post." "A little to the left," Margaret called. "There, perfect." Caleb climbed down and stood beside her, both of them looking up at their handiwork. The sign represented everything they'd built together over the winter, not just a business partnership, but a family, a home, a future. "Your mother would have loved this," Caleb said quietly, seeing her daughter's name up there, "knowing we were finally together." "I wish I could have known her," Margaret said, "but in a way, I feel like I do. Through her journal, through your stories, through—" She touched the locket at her throat. "Through this, I carry her with me every day." They'd spent the winter months not just surviving, but thriving. After the confrontation with Harvey Morrison, Caleb had indeed hired a lawyer from Denver, a sharp young man named Peters, who'd taken great satisfaction in dismantling Harvey's fraudulent claims. The supposed court order had been revealed as a forgery, the debts largely invented. Harvey had been forced to pay a fine and publicly apologize. He hadn't been heard from since. More importantly, Peters had helped Caleb legally establish Margaret's identity and his paternity. There was now official documentation filed with the territorial government confirming that Margaret Hayes Morrison was the daughter of Caleb Stone and Elizabeth Hayes Stone, stolen as an infant and recently reunited with her father. Rachel's deception was a matter of legal record now, her lies finally exposed to the light. With that settled, Caleb had done something else. He'd drawn up a new will, leaving everything to Margaret. The trading post, the land, his savings, all of it. "I don't plan on dying any time soon," he'd told her with a slight smile. "But when I do, I want there to be no question. This is yours. It always was." The trading post itself had flourished under their joint management. Margaret had proven to have a natural head for business, negotiating fair but firm deals with trappers and native traders alike. She'd expanded their inventory, organized the stock more efficiently, even started a small garden plot behind the building where she planned to grow vegetables for trade and for their own table. Word had spread about the partnership, and more customers came through now. They liked dealing with Margaret, found her fair and honest and pleasant. Some of the older trappers joked that Caleb had gotten downright sociable since his daughter arrived, and it was true. With Margaret there, the trading post felt less like a hermitage and more like what Caleb had always secretly hoped it could be, a real home. On this particular spring morning, as they admired their new sign, a familiar figure approached on horseback. Joe Hawkins, the grizzled trapper who'd commented on Margaret's presence months ago, rode up with a grin. "Well now," he said, dismounting and tipping his hat to Margaret. "Stone and daughter. Makes it official, don't it? It does, Caleb said, shaking his hand. What brings you down from the high country, Joe? Needed supplies. And I heard tell there was a new sign going up. Wanted to see it for myself. Joe studied it with approval. Fine work. You do the carving stone? I did. Thought so. Got that same careful touch as that spoon you keep over the fireplace. Joe winked at Margaret. Your ma's spoon, I'm guessing? It is, Margaret said with a smile. Would you like some coffee, Mr. Hawkins? We just put a fresh pot on. Don't mind if I do. Inside, as they served Joe his coffee and filled his order for supplies, the trapper regaled them with stories from his winter trap lines. Margaret listened with genuine interest, asking questions, laughing at his jokes. Caleb watched them interact and felt something he hadn't felt in 30 years. Contentment. Not just survival, not just getting through another day, but actual happiness. After Joe left, Margaret organized the new stock while Caleb updated the ledger. They worked in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes when people are truly at ease with each other. I've been thinking, Margaret said after a while, about the future. Caleb looked up from his numbers. Oh, this place could be more than a trading post. We have good land here, water from the creek, space for expansion. We could build a proper house, maybe a small inn for travelers. Make this a real settlement. You want to build? Caleb asked, intrigued. I want to grow, Margaret said. I spent so many years just surviving, just existing from one day to the next. Now I have a chance to actually build something, with you, for us. She paused, then added, and maybe someday, for others. Family. Caleb understood what she meant. Margaret was only 29. There was time for her to marry again, this time for love, time for children, his grandchildren. The thought filled him with unexpected joy. I think that sounds wonderful, he said. They worked until sunset, then sat together on the porch, watching the mountains turn purple and gold in the fading light. Margaret leaned her head on Caleb's shoulder, and he put his arm around her, a gesture that had become natural, familiar, right. You know what I think about sometimes, Margaret said. That day I stumbled in here, starving and desperate, asking for leftovers. I thought I was just asking for food. I had no idea I was actually asking for everything. A father, a home, a future, a family. Everything I'd been missing my whole life. I knew the moment I saw you, Caleb admitted. Recognized something in your eyes, your face. 30 years I waited, and there you were, asking the simplest question in the world. And I got to answer it by giving you everything I had. You gave me more than that, Margaret said softly. You gave me myself, my real self, not the person Rachel wanted me to be or Thomas's family wanted to use. You gave me the truth about who I am and where I come from. That's worth more than any amount of food or shelter. They sat in companionable silence as the stars began to emerge. A coyote called in the distance, and somewhere a night bird sang. The world was settling into its evening rhythms, peaceful and whole. Do you think she's watching? Margaret asked. Elizabeth, your wife, my mother. Do you think she knows we found each other? Caleb thought about that, about Elizabeth's last words, her desperate plea for him to take care of their daughter, about the promise he'd made and finally, 30 years later, kept. I think she knows, he said, and I think she's at peace. We're finally together, the three of us. Not the way she wanted, not the way any of us would have chosen, but together nonetheless. A family. Margaret squeezed his hand. A family, she repeated. I like the sound of that. Above them, the new sign creaked gently in the breeze. Stone and daughter. A promise made good. A family reunited. A home built not just of wood and stone, but of love and truth, and the patient faith that good things, given enough time and hope, can finally come to pass. In the morning, the world would bring new challenges, new customers, new adventures. But tonight, a father and daughter sat together under the Colorado stars, whole at last, and that was more than enough.